I'm Gabe Filippelli. I'm a professor of earth sciences, but over the last 10 years I've been working a lot on environmental health issues. So that's how environment actually affects human health. My work specifically with lead and lead poisoning is to better understand why it is that some populations seem to be so vulnerable to lead poisoning. Lead is a neural toxin and a renal toxin, so it affects both the nerve system, plus it affects your ability to handle water, kidneys basically. Lead is always present naturally in the environment, but usually really, really low levels. It ends up like with a lot of industrial activities, we've concentrated lead. And we've concentrated it largely in cities. And so for adults and for the general population, when they're exposed to high levels of lead, they show several characteristic symptoms. One is that they get tremors because it affects your nervous system. You get tremors. You can get kidney failure, which is bad for anybody. There's this effect on cardiovascular system, so heart disease and high blood pressure. Children from prenatal to about 6 or so, they're busy building all of those neural networks that we all have in our head, right, and in our nervous system. And when you get lead in your system, especially when you're at that age, when you're forming these neurons, the neurons form incorrectly because, not to get too technical, but lead looks just like calcium to your body. Identical, same size and everything. Calcium is really important for your neurons. It's what we call a neurotransmitter. But the problem is when there's lead there, your neurons form to the shape and charge of lead. Unfortunately, it's slightly different than calcium. So once it's formed that way, it's permanently formed incorrectly. So your nerves don't function right. And so that's physiologically why kids are particularly sensitive.
I'm John Ellis. I'm a pediatrician. I've worked with the State Department of Health in the lead poisoning prevention program. Lead poisoning for children is a worse problem for several reasons. Number one, the same amount of lead is it's a bigger dose for a child because they're smaller than an adult. It's a problem because children are growing and developing, and lead interferes with the growth and development of a variety of cells, most notably brain and nerve cells, and causes a permanent injury wherever it goes. Generally speaking, it's believed that those damages, particularly to the nervous system, are permanent.
What that does is it puts them in a permanent intellectual disadvantage. So there's a very strong relationship between exposure to lead as a kid and lower IQ. First of all, they're less intelligent because they're not processing thoughts like they should be if they weren't poisoned as a youth. The other thing is kind of obvious too. You think about, in order to have attention to detail or attention to task, you have to have, your neurological system has to be focused on something and very consistent. When part of that's compromised, you lose that attention to task. And what we call that clinically is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So kids usually have really strong ADHD issues. So think about this a little bit. If you lose some intelligence and you have a lot of hyperactivity or attention deficit disorders, you're not going to perform well in school, right? And so that automatically puts you at a disadvantage later on in life. You are much more likely to be in prison systems, incarcerated for violent crimes. That's likely because decision-making abilities and employment potential and education potential are so low for some of these kids exposed that they end up living lives of crime. There's about 4 main sources, or there were 4 main sources of lead to the environment. One source was lead in paint. Lead was used in paint for a very long time. Lead made very durable paint and very flexible, actually. We became aware of paint issues and lead poisoning of kids pretty early on. So lead-based paint is really, it hasn't been used in residential areas for about 40 years or so, 50 years. Lead was in gasoline. That was used from in the 20s until 1980. And then there is lead in solder and water pipes. And in fact, in water pipes themselves, there's industrial facilities that process lead smelting plants. And often they were in cities. A city like Indianapolis, for example, had several large smelting plants, which ended up emitting quite a bit of lead into their local environment, within a mile or two of these plants.
Lead paint on surfaces ages, it tends to crack and chip, and it reportedly has a kind of sweet taste. So kids will eat lead paint if they have an opportunity. In addition, lead paint on, say, a window, when the window goes up and down, it turns that lead paint into dust. And that lead paint, then the lead dust goes everywhere. It's on not only the floor, it's on toys, it's on eating utensils and so forth.
So from our work, particularly here in Indianapolis, and this is coincident with some of my colleagues who work in New Orleans, we found that the largest health burden for lead is in children of color and low-income populations. So they have rates of lead exposure about 3 to 5 times the national average, typically. And that's from several factors, I think. One of them is that they tend to live in areas with poor home maintenance and landscape maintenance. That has two implications. If your home is not maintained very well, for example, if you're a renter, you're not going to be dealing with paint or anything like that. So you typically have a lot more degraded lead paint in your home and right outside your home than a homeowner. Also, the soils around your house might be maintained less well, so that all of that lead that deposited in the soils from gasoline or from eroded paint, decayed paint, you're much more likely to come in contact with it.
There may be some other factors, nutritional factors, such as a diet that's maybe low in iron, calcium, or protein that might make them more at risk.
For all of Marion County, all of Indianapolis, we've been able to map out the pattern, what we call the spatial pattern in lead exposure of kids. And we can map that out by using data of how much lead is in kids' blood. And so when we produce that map, it has some pretty striking features. There's a couple areas that seem to be the highest risk for kids are in these areas. One of them is the Near West community, which is right over the White River from the IUPUI campus. Another is our Martindale Brightwood community, which is just east of downtown. And another area is this kind of broad community up north of 20th, south of 38th, on either side of Meridian Street. South of 38th Street, you have fairly high amount of lead in the environment and a lot of lead poisoning. Just north of 38th Street, you also have a fairly high amount of lead, almost no lead poisoning. And it's because the income disparity. The people north of 38th, they're not immune to lead risk because they're really aware of the issues of lead and they've done everything they can in their homes to reduce it. No, in fact, inadvertently, they keep their homes more maintained because there's a much higher home ownership rate there. They keep their yards maintained because of peer pressure to have a nice yard, or even individual interest to have a nice yard. Playgrounds are done the right way. There's not a lot of dirt around. There's mulch and all of the normal expensive things you expect in a middle to upper middle class neighborhood like Meridian Kessler. And just south of there, of course, the society is making all the wrong decisions in terms of lead exposure. You have a lot of vacant or under occupied homes where there's very little incentive for landlord to maintain them. There's not enough policy to come in and provide support for landlords to actually maintain properties adequately. Frankly, the rental return is probably so low that even a $500 investment to landscaping is beyond the means of any kind of profit margin. If you imagine this as a multi-generational phenomenon, lead doesn't go away, right? I live in this neighborhood. I might have been lead burdened myself. I have children, and so my future is a little bit dimmer than those who live in an area where they weren't lead affected. My children might also have a dimmer future. Maybe they were lead affected, or maybe I just have not achieved the potential I could have, so therefore I can't provide for my children the same kind of resources that my equivalent across the street in a non-contaminated area has.